Welcome to all of you. My name is Peter Karoff, and from the studios of the Philanthropic Initiative in Boston, we're happy to bring you Tuesdays at TPI. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to the 200 of you who are online, wherever you are, in time zones all over the place, across this country and in different parts of the world. We're really glad you're here. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce this very attractive person to my left, or maybe on the screen to your right, Peggy Delaney. Say hello.
Hello, everybody.
And say hello to Peggy. I think I'd like to begin with a contextual question, even before we get into why we're here, and it goes to a comment that was made in Monterey at the 2005 TED conference, the Technology, Education, and Design conference that brings 800 thought leaders together for an exploration. And in the room were the founders of all kinds of places, like Google and AOL and Amazon and Oracle and Microsoft and on and on and on. And from the main stage, the most intriguing comment was this one. It was this: I don't know what technology wants to be. What does technology want to be? I think it's a fascinating question, and I think it directly relates here in terms of what does philanthropy want to be? What do we want to be in that connection? So welcome to Tuesdays at TPI. This is the fifth in a series of programs that we've put together that we hope have pushed the envelope a bit around important issues facing the field of philanthropy. And this is the first time we've had this video streamed out, which is kind of exciting and interesting. In addition, WGBH-FM, which is the PBS affiliate in Boston, is recording this, and it will be on their website for 3 years, the WGBH Forum website. So it's an exciting way to extend an hour plus of conversation to greater life. The Philanthropic Initiative, which many of you participating know us well, others are new to us. We have been a nonprofit organization working in the philanthropic space for 16 years. Our business, if you will, is the promotion of philanthropy, of strategic philanthropy, of helping donors find a match between their dreams and their critical thinking. And as part of that, we've done a series of educational programs. Most of them have not been about global issues the way this one is. But in 92, 3, and 4, was it, Peggy? Or was it 3, 4, and 5? The Synergos Institute, an organization Peggy Delaney founded 20 years ago, and TPI held 3 conferences on global philanthropy at a time when it was very hard to get people's attention around this subject. And a lot has changed. We're going to talk a bit about what has changed. But that is the whole notion behind this conversation. And the subject that we've chosen today is part of an ongoing project here that will result in a book called The World We Want, which will be an attempt to do some really strong visioning about the kind of world we want and how we might get there. What are the concrete things that we might be able to do to realize our vision? And we're starting off this session with a conversation that is a very hard one to have, and one that, to some degree, is one that you wonder that you can even ask this question that I'm about to ask Peggy Delaney. Can you eliminate poverty? Is that even possible? Is it even the right way to talk about it? And why is there so much talk about it? And I'm especially interested, Peggy, you have been at this work for almost 4 decades, which I asked whether I could say that. She said, oh, all right. And I wonder whether you might just share a little bit how you came to a point where you wanted to try to deal on an issue this big, this complicated. You were a child of privilege. You were graced by having a father in David Rockefeller who was truly a globalist before that term was even a term. But tell us a bit about what you thought you were doing, what you thought you would get out of this, what could happen.
Well, Peter, you're referring to when I was 17 and went and lived in Brazil, which vastly relieved my parents because it got me away from my then boyfriend for the summer. And all I knew was that I wanted to do something socially useful, and had the opportunity. I hooked up with an American anthropologist who was doing work in the favelas or squatter settlements in Rio de Janeiro. And actually very quickly disabused myself of the notion that I was doing anything useful at that age. I started off giving injections in a clinic in a squatter settlement where the kids were going out and playing in the sewers. So, I mean, it was very apparent that giving injections was not going to be the resolution of the root problem that led there to be open sewers in that situation. What I got out of that situation, and that's kind of the kernel that stuck with me and that's led me to stick with this theme through all these years, was that the people living in these squatter settlements in absolutely minimal conditions had such a strong desire to improve their lives and to get out of poverty that it overshadowed anything I've ever seen since in terms of people on the outside trying to solve people on the inside's problems. And what stuck with me was that if the will, the imagination, the creativity was there, so what was missing? And what was missing was links, was connections for those people with information, with education, with jobs, with influence, with decision-making power. And I couldn't have articulated this 40 years ago, but that is what stuck and what led me to create Synergos and get involved, because I figured that with all that energy out there dedicated toward people resolving their own problems, all it needed really was some relatively small complement that was missing.
In these years, Synergos, which is, for those of you who do not know, an NGO with about a $6 or $7 million a year budget that has worked in how many countries?
We've worked for years intensively in 9, but that's just increased by a few.
In the time since you started working on this, what would you say have been the big changes?
You mean in the world with regard to...
In the world that you're trying to address, in the world that you're trying to do something about, what have been the really big changes?
Well, if you want to look at the gloomy side first, poverty has increased. And that is the fact. So it's a pretty discouraging fact. If you take the premise that I just stated a minute ago, how could it go on increasing? I would say that part of the reason for that is, in fact, the divisions have increased, which is also paradoxical because that's happening in a time when communication is better, when people travel more, when there are more opportunities for connections, and yet the divisions continue. So that's on the negative side of the spectrum. I think on the positive side of the spectrum, the fact that, unfortunately, it's usually disasters rather than successes, but the fact that things that happen in the world globally more often now get into the news and people see it and they resonate with it and they want to do something about it. And as a result of that, people know more about the kinds of organizations that are doing at least relief work, if not development work. So, and I'm talking about this country. But still, when Americans travel, for example, and I'm talking for the moment about Americans, if you go to a country, what are the chances that you're really going to be able to connect with local groups who are doing something good on the ground and be able to make a difference through that connection? Still fairly small, I would say.
I read in the paper this morning Bill Gates being quoted at the World Health Association meeting, which is being held right now, in which he says that the more he looked at the disparity in health care and vaccine availability in the poorest nations, he said it was stunning to me. I thought that was just an interesting. Here's a person who may have one of the most incredible intellects of our time, who finds it stunning that when he sees this, and with that, it seems to persist. Talk a bit about the UN Millennium Development Goals, which have established 8 goals to be achieved over a 30-year period on a whole range of things, including the goal of reducing the deepest poverty, those that live on less than $1 a day, by half between now and 2015. Is that a goal that is realizable? Are the resources in hand to do that, or is that still a aspiration that doesn't have traction?
Well, first of all, I think it was fantastic that the world was able to agree on these goals. It's the first time that countries, businesses, civil society has gotten together and actually agreed on very specific targets. I don't think they would have agreed on them if they didn't feel there were at least the possibility of achieving those goals. So I find that encouraging. However, what's happened between the time the goals were agreed to and now is not enough if we're going to keep up a constant rate of moving toward achieving them. But let me speak by giving one example of why it is achievable, but not if we keep doing what we're doing. As you know, we're working with Unilever and UNICEF and our partner organization, Genron, in India to try to have child malnutrition in India by 2015. And what's clear in the kind of grounding interviews we've done of all the stakeholders, because this will be a major partnership approach, is that it's not resources that are lacking. It's not even the solutions that are lacking. There are technical solutions, there are community development solutions, there are educational solutions, there are just thinking about corruption and how one might reduce that as a form of solution. It is that the stakeholders are not thinking together in an effective way, and that they haven't decided which direction to go. The government provides $6 billion a year in India for this, but it's not getting there. So the question is more, how do you get all the actors together, and how do you get people willing to think collectively and then take a concerted action together, rather than whether it is technically possible?
You imply that it isn't resources necessarily. It is, in fact, process, or more of an open system of how to do these things.
Yeah, there may be some countries in the world where the resources are not there, but India, which is a big country and fundamentally a wealthy country and committed to doing something, it's not a resource question.
It's interesting because in Jeffrey Sachs's book and in his theory of how to approach this, and some of the folks here in Boston heard Jeffrey Sachs speak this morning, he makes a big case that if the U.S. in particular doesn't step up to the plate, it isn't going to happen. And that, in fact, people haven't stepped up to the plate. And then Bono, it's Bono, right?
Yeah.
I sometimes pronounce it another way around this office, and I get grief. Bono, in his very eloquent way, saying it shouldn't be where you live, where you were born, that determines whether you live. And his full court press to get the U.S. to step up to the plate. And then the percentages, which I don't have, but I'm sure Paula Johnson, TPI's senior fellow, has in her head of the percent of our GMP that we're currently developing.
that we're currently giving to
is
overseas.
less, is way low, way low. So if that's the case, then it seems to me resources become a huge piece.
Well, here we are sitting in the U.S. where we could be doing a lot more. Interestingly, the general public thinks we're giving 10% of our resources overseas. And when asked whether that's about right or too much, they say, well, that's about right, but not more than that. Paula, am I right that it's 0.01%? Yeah. So it is extraordinarily small what we're giving. A lot of countries have said, well, we should try to get to 0.07% or to 0.1%. To point what?
0.7.
0.7, that's what I mean, 0.7%, yeah. So we're a long way from what we could be doing to come anywhere near parity with other countries.
Do you think, though, that the fundamental assumption that one can end poverty, can you say that? Is it realistic to say that? The poor have always been with us?
You know, I don't believe only in technology, but the technology is there to end poverty now, whereas maybe it wasn't before. It may have been that before you simply couldn't get to certain communities to work on issues where very isolated groups were living. That is no longer the case. In my view, it's a question of political will and willingness to work together.
What's interesting, I saw some material today about the fact that the American people, this is a domestic side of the coin, 65% of the population in surveys continually want more of a safety net in this country, want more funding for education, for human services. So the population seems to be in one place. The political structure and the political control is in another place. And that has got to be true, I suppose, worldwide. But here we have it very dramatically, which is very interesting. Here are some words from Alan Broadbent, who is TPI's board chair. Poverty, this became our key focus, and Alan is talking about the key focus of the Maytree Foundation that he and Judy started 20 years ago. Poverty became our key focus. A society's toleration of poverty is probably the fundamental threat to stability. In many societies, poverty becomes systemic. In other words, it is embedded in the institutional fabric, into the cultural, social, legal, and economic patterns of the society. Poverty is an unjustifiable burden to millions of people that also results in paralyzing costs to all of society. It perpetuates a vicious cycle by limiting opportunity and repressing the human spirit. The correlation between poverty and most serious social problems is a stunning indictment of our continued tolerance of poetry. I mean, when you look at that and you look at the overwhelming part, what are the things you think that hold us back from being able to deal with that? And why are we not? Why is not the political will in line with what one might be called our humanness? What's missing?
Are you asking that in terms of the United States?
No, either way. Either way.
Yeah. Well, I would have to answer that at a couple of different levels. One, I don't know how other people feel about this, but I have the sense that people feel there's a very narrow line between them and others. That is to say, there but for the grace of God go I. And that it is scary for people to see others who are not making it. And for people who haven't really looked inside and who haven't really opened their hearts, it is easier to look away than to look at. And that, I don't know whether you'd call that a spiritual or a psychological factor, is in my view, one. Then I think there's a second level which has to do sort of with maybe economic and psychological, and that is that if people feel they're not getting enough themselves, and here the psychological element of this is often enough money and love get confused. And if people don't feel enough love from their childhood on, enough sense of security, any economic insecurity will be magnified. And so if people feel, even if, let's say, they're middle class, but they've had this sense of threatenedness all their lives, they're liable to look after number one because they're afraid there's not going to be enough to go around. And then we have political issues in which there are groups that have different theories and philosophies about what it is that's going to make positive change. So you have a very real group that genuinely believes that trickling down is the way that is going to get the bottom to come up. And other people who very much don't believe that, who believe you have to, at some way, empower those at the bottom with the tools so that they can move up. And that means putting a fair amount of government funding into social programs that would do that. So that there's, even at the political level, there is dissension across. And finally, another way of looking at the political level is you've got divisions across countries, in which, if you take our own present circumstance as an example, there's the philosophy of you're with us or against us. And if you're with us on the example of, for example, Iraq, then we'll help you with other things. But if you're not, we're not going to be helpful unless your economic situation is so much in our self-interest that you'll be willing to help. So it's a pretty, in my view, complex array of impediments that we need to break through.
I would add a few of the other elements, which is, I think, individuals, and we have an interesting group that is listening into this, participating. Some of the people online are very much involved in development in these issues. Others are with community foundations, others are donors, others are NGOs of different types. But I think the broader public is very much affected by the overwhelming amount of data that we get, the numbness that we feel from so much information, and that a great many people, what I call, sleepwalk through. And it does circle back to your comment that you tend to then hunker in, and it's in the paper that was written for this conference. I use the Albert Einstein quote in which he talks about the fact that we're all, in essence, in a prison of our own making, and it's living our lives. How do we break out of that? And it's very, very difficult. I mean, it's why, clearly why, when you have a September 11th, or you have the crisis in Southeast Asia, I think all of that is swept away and people rise up in a way that is really profound. But it's also clear you can't take that and make a case out of it and say things have now changed. And on one level they have changed, and on one level they haven't changed. But in the TPI experience, interest in global issues is quite a bit higher. And then in the Synergos instance, where you have totally been focused on global issues, increasing numbers of wealthy families and foundations have been drawn to become actors in this process.
But since I was actually going to ask you, Peter, because since people don't come to us unless they already are interested, but you start with a domestic agenda and are open to global, what do you see as the shift? Why is it that?
Well, in TPI's approach, we always ask that question of every family or individual or corporation: is there a global interest? And the flip answer had always been in the early years: why should I give to the third world when I've got a third world 2 miles down the street in my own city or my own area? So. But there clearly are more people thinking that way. In the work that Paula Johnson has done here at TPI, looking at the global infrastructure for donors, which has begun to increase, but not that substantially. So one is simply knowing what to do, which has been the classic TPI frame from the beginning. People want to do something but don't know how to do that. It becomes even harder to think about what to do in Kenya, even though we do have some people here who I know have funded things in Kenya, but they're rare. So part of it is more availability. There are some people on the call from Acumen, which was established by the Rockefeller Foundation to provide that kind of intermediary. So I think that's, and then Synergos itself, you have 55 or 60 families with foundations, with means, trying to look at it, so it has shifted. But it still is, the numbers are still significant. Of the $240 billion the Americans gave to philanthropy last year, how much went abroad? What's the answer to that? 2%. 2%. So
that's held constant over several years.
Yeah, and just to make a quick analogy, Peggy, to what you said.
And would you identify yourself, please?
Paula Johnson, Senior Fellow at TPI. I don't mean to interrupt, but I'm just so struck by these public surveys that say Americans believe that we're giving in foreign aid something like 10%. And there haven't been any formal studies, but anecdotally, I think it's very true in international philanthropy also, that when you ask a group, how much of U.S. philanthropy do you think goes overseas? The answer I get normally is around 20%. And in fact, it does hover somewhere around 2%
Yep.
or less.
Yep.
I think one of the things that is of particular interest for us here today is the relationship between philanthropy and development. What is that relationship? And in the paper that was distributed, in which I use this term open source philanthropy, and social change in a flat world, I was accused of talking Greek. And if you've read the paper, you may still think it's Greek, but at least if it were Roman, it wouldn't be as good, I suppose. Greeks were wisdom. They were all these classy ideas. But the whole notion of trying to be open, trying to think about philanthropy from the perspective of a flow of ideas that enables you to think more systemically, more holistically. And there is a silo problem in almost everything we do, certainly in our giving, and how to open that up is particularly interesting. But what is your sense, Peggy, of the fact you've got in poverty this immense need, huge need for government intervention? Where does philanthropy fit? Where do you put that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I love thinking about that question because I think that philanthropy can have a very key, even if always proportionately very small role in the dollars that flow. With the members of the Global Philanthropist Circle, who now come from about 18 different countries around the world, we've emphasized that the importance of what each family can do alone, starting with that, is going to reside not only in their money, but their connections, their influence, their education, their talent, and they're willing to use those on behalf of the issues they care about. And that they'll be able to multiply what they can do if they're willing to put all of those things behind their money. I think that's even more true in other countries than it is here, mainly because the elite, the percentage of people in the elites is usually smaller, and therefore they have disproportionate influence. And if they start using it on behalf of development, it's going to make a really big difference. But the second thing is that because they do have the connections to others, government is always going to have to play the biggest role. But in most countries, those who are in the kinds of influential positions that philanthropists are or could be if they chose to use that influence, have the possibility of not only being able to influence government, but also be able to convene the different stakeholders, including, by the way, those affected by poverty, who are those usually not included at the table, so that if they begin to play that kind of convening and possibly facilitating role, the synergies are going to multiply, and the effect, therefore, can be far, far greater, not only than their philanthropic contribution, but also even than the governments alone.
And in terms of the what you're calling, or what Synergos is calling, and Genron is calling, whole system partnerships, they're tri-sector. They're foundations and donors, they're government, and they're corporations.
And civil society.
And civil society. So you have all these players. The corporate world is the villain in the globalization story, or the market economy is being judged to be the villain. And development from a commercial perspective, with its environmental and other implications, are so severe. How much awareness do you think there is on the corporate world? The UN has a global compact, which I believe several hundred companies have signed, that in essence have them buying into what might be the development goals. Do you see that increasing?
I actually do see it increasing. Because I haven't done the study, what I don't know is whether the increase is still anecdotal or whether it really is a sea change in terms of how corporations are going to behave for the future. And let me just give one example. One of the whole systems partnerships that we're working on has to do with creating more sustainable food chains, all the way from small local producers through agribusinesses, through government policies, through trade policies, to the large distributors of food. What is astounding is that right from the beginning, 8 agribusinesses signed on because they're at the point where they realize that for environmental purposes, because the land is being degraded where the food's being produced, for economic purposes, because it's not going to work if you can't produce the food cheaply the way they have been, and even for health purposes, because they're about to get sued for producing foods that are promoting obesity on the one hand and malnutrition on the other. They need to change. So this was something that basically was coming from them, led by the head of Cisco, the large food distribution company. So on particular areas, I would say some of the oil companies around their policies relating to indigenous people and biodiversity is another area where you're beginning to see some change. I'm encouraged, at least by the anecdotal evidence, of the change in some corporate leadership's thinking about how they have to approach these issues.
Corporate leadership thinking changing because their self-interest is being affected primarily, or for broader purposes? Is it self-interest?
First of all, I think all of us at some level always think in terms of self-interest. It may be easier for some individuals to justify that in a moral position. But I actually think that some corporate leaders are beginning to feel very uneasy about the impact of what's been happening as a result of globalization or specific corporate policies on the world. So I think for some individuals it's broader than that, but I almost prefer to take the self-interest route, even though I'd rather everyone have a conversion and get concerned about this. And the reason for that is that it's only when it gets grounded in genuine long-term self-interest that corporate policies are going to shift in a major way.
Self-interest from a commercial perspective, or self-interest from a human perspective?
I think that it will be both, and that it's going to start from a commercial, because the quarterly bottom line is going to be impacted by climate change, by general degradation of the environment, by instability resulting from poverty. I mean, those could be viewed as commercial, but they could also, as in the case of Brazil, where suddenly the business leaders took an interest in the issue of street children and crime in general, because suddenly they were having to live behind bars. Their families had to go to school in armored cars. They had to carry guns and have bodyguards. They had to have bars on their windows because the situation was so out of control. So that tends to hit you in the gut when you're worried about your kid getting kidnapped on the way to school. It became very personal.
I mean, it's sort of the other side of the argument about terrorism, the attempts to make the link between terrorism and poverty. Do you think they're strong links?
You know, I think that case can be made, but I don't think it's a valid generic case to be made. I mean, the country I know best, which is Brazil, has had horrible poverty for a long time and no terrorism. However, it's had a lot of violent crime. So I think it's pushing it pretty far to say, if you don't deal with poverty, you're going to have terrorism in this society, because that's not the way all societies are going to respond.
So when you look at the philanthropic intervention, and you think of what philanthropy can do, you've made the case that philanthropy, on the one hand, is this convener. It's a matter of access. What are some of the other examples of where you've seen philanthropy really come into a global situation around poverty and be substantive?
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to give you an example from South Africa. One of the members of the Global Philanthropist Circle, the Applebaum family, has started a distance education program that is now going Africa-wide. And in fact, they're in contact with Brazil to get curriculum in Portuguese so they can use it in the Lusophone countries. It's what you've called for a long time strategic philanthropy. And I think this is really where philanthropists, using their money and their minds and their hearts, have an opportunity to make a difference, again, way out of proportion to the amount of money they put in. If they hit the right button at the right time, an investment that could even be relatively small in terms of the amount of money someone has can awaken a whole population to the possibilities of an entirely new strategy that then other corporations and individuals and governments will invest in.
It's what we call the gap, finding that gap, right, Leslie Pine? Is that what we call it? I think there's been a tremendous amount of interest, including among a number of the people here, in microcredit as an opportunity. And I remember Ron Rubin, when he was Treasury, Robert Rubin, coming up with a number. I even forget the number, but it wasn't immense. It might have been around $20 billion that could take a significant portion of the poor population through microcredit. Do you feel that it, not to be critical about it, do you think that has been overplayed? Do you think there's been romanticized? Is it?
I don't think it's been overplayed, and I think it's a great strategy. And there's no question that access to credit is something that is an impediment to very small producers or the informal sector from getting out of poverty. What I think is that the strategies, and this comes back to the strategic that have been used, are still relatively at the micro level. It is largely NGOs, many of whom don't have financial experience, although increasingly you're getting bigger groups that do, that are applying it at a very local level. Now, this has the positive effect that they know the population, they know who's going to repay, they know how to structure it because they understand the culture. The problem is that it's the financial institutions that understand how to make this work at scale. But giving very small loans is not financially viable for them at scale. So something's going to have to happen that will bring together the closeness to the ground, the credibility, the knowledge of the groups that the NGOs have, and the ability to do a large-scale thing that the financial institutions have, so that this can go to scale. Because if you suddenly have access to funds from the financial institutions, then whether it's 20 billion or 100 billion, or million, which were we talking about? Billion. Well, whichever. Those funds are going to be there, because if they see it as a viable business, the money will be there.
I'm interested in what your view is of the relationship of the immense focus on health in the very poorest countries, certainly from the Gates Foundation and from others, and how how that connects in your mind to development.
You know, yesterday it was announced that the Gates Foundation was committing another $250 million to health initiatives in the poorest countries, and I read the Seattle Times article and the interview with Bill Gates on that. And it was very interesting to me because he was making the argument that if you simply find the cures and make the vaccines and all of that available, that will be the kind of starter that addresses the poverty issue, because there was a criticism coming that, well, why not just take on poverty? And he said something to the effect, or somebody else said, it's not enough to just provide a scientific solution. You need the process. You need the community involvement. This is a very interesting point. First of all, I think he has every right in the world to decide, because we know that vaccine development and cures for malaria and all of this are absolutely needed. So if he wants to apply it there, that's fine. But I do believe that it's not going to be enough. And that whereas health is a great starting point, because after all, if people are ill, they're not going to have the energy to work and actually get themselves out of poverty. I don't think it's enough. And if I look at my favorite development experience, which is Gram Vikas in Orissa in India, where very much the focus that comes out of the community has to do with sanitation and health. But it is the process of consulting the community that first of all gets the women to the table with a voice, because Gram Vikas insists that the dialogues have both women and men. The women invariably choose that. Clean water, sanitation, and access to some kind of health care, reducing disease. They will choose it, but it's the fact of them being able to be the ones that choose it that make them invest in it, and then that make the systems that are developed work.
You haven't changed your view in 20 years, have you?
Sorry, just an old stick in the mud.
This is what you saw in that village in Brazil.
Also,
exactly right. Which is, it is interesting how this. Philanthropy in most people's mind is money. Those of us who have attempted to work in this for a little bit realize that, sure, it's money, but that's not all it is. And process is huge. But most of all, and this is a lesson that where TPI and Senegos's values are totally shared, if it isn't about the community, it's about nothing. It will not happen. So it has to come out of the community. When you, I'd like to, by the way, invite anyone here who has any questions to raise their hand. Would you identify yourself and
Sure.
and do so?
My name is Patricia Keenan, and I work at the United Way of Massachusetts Bay here in Boston, and we work on really sort of core urban poverty issues. This morning there was a very nice talk at the Boston Foundation about post-tsunami philanthropy, and I was wondering, as we listened to all the conversation about global solutions and how it seems to be critical that they come up, the solutions are at least partially coming up from the people who are experiencing the problem. Are there lessons from those responses that could be used to address the problems of urban poverty in the United States?
lessons from how the response to the tsunami went?
Well, no, just the response to global situations in general. Like
Oh,
you
I
mentioned
see,
what
yes.
you saw in Brazil.
Yes.
How you were so moved by the eagerness of the people to improve their own lot and how they need to be part of the relief of their problem. And I
Yes.
wondered to what extent could that thinking apply to deal with urban
Right.
issues here in the U.S.?
Yeah. Well, let me make one distinction before saying how maybe there are lessons to be learned, and that is that in most countries there hasn't been the long history of social welfare programs that we have had, which for good or for bad have shaped how our communities feel about what they ought to be getting and how our government feels about what it ought to be giving. So that in a sense you could say that in developing countries facing crises like this, most of them have not had the resources or the political will to apply to addressing those problems. So that makes it a different situation. In a funny kind of way, because we have had social programs that have waxed and waned over different administrations and generations, I would say that people expect more from the government, and therefore maybe don't expect as much as people I've seen in other countries. And I don't want to categorize widely, but I'm talking about groups in this country that have been on welfare, let's say, for multiple generations. Mm-hmm. That is just not the experience of other countries. Mm-hmm. And so we have a challenge that I don't think the experience of other countries is parallel enough to be a lesson. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, we also have an incredible history of entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship, whereas many countries I know, entrepreneurship is not encouraged. So one question I would ask, and actually put it back to you, is there some way that we can develop some cross-fertilization between those in this country that have come up from the grassroots through their own either entrepreneurial instincts or mentoring or programs, and could we, rather than take a social welfare approach, which I totally believe has to be there as a safety net, but could we inject into that some kind of entrepreneurial education or exchange so that we can get out of what is, in my view, very uncharacteristic of the poor around the world, which is a sense of, I can't do it.
Sure. To sort of alleviate a sense of multi-generational hopelessness and sort of diminished expectation.
Yeah. So what would your answer be?
It's very interesting. I'd be happy to get back to the program staff where I work around.
And it does, we have a program at TPI called Boston Neighborhood Fellows, where we find 6 unsung heroes and we go out into the city and we celebrate them and give them $30,000 and all kinds of wonderful things. And I remember there was a group in the office a few years ago, and that this very point that Peggy came up, in which someone said, "We don't get the services we need." And another person said, "That's wrong. We don't want services. You shouldn't want services. That's the problem. We don't want services. What we want is an opportunity to really do it ourselves." And I think that's part of the lesson. Other question?
My name is Tom Hazlett. Peggy, question for you. You talked about collaboration and the need to work within community. My question is, the Synergos Fellowship, how has that worked? What have been the discoveries, the successes, and the challenges of creating networks of entrepreneurs, if you will, working together to advance social change?
Thank you. Just for clarification for those who don't know what the Synergos Senior Fellows is, it's a 3-year appointment for people who work largely in community foundations, although there are some members from family foundations and corporate foundations, to work across countries. There's a network of about 65 to 75 people, each of whom has been successful in their own careers in solving some aspect of community empowerment, grant-making, governance, some aspect of what foundations as bridging organizations in the community have to face. What I love about it is that through this peer network, which is what it is, people have had the opportunity to learn from each other's experiences. And so what worked well in Mozambique, our Mozambican fellow might go to Thailand and have an opportunity to work on an issue that the Thais are particularly concerned about. Or someone from a U.S. community foundation might go to some other part of the world. And it provides an opportunity, just the question you were asking, Patricia, so that you get cross-cultural comparisons and cross-cultural opportunities for people who've had a solution one place. And we try to think of, if someone in Thailand is looking for someone to come, we try to think what society among our fellows might have had an experience that actually would be parallel and relevant, not just throw anyone together with anyone else.
And the organization, Tom, that has been probably most successful at that kind of thing has been Ashoka, which with its 2,700 fellows around the world has increasingly created that kind of cross-networking opportunity.
Yeah, John O'Quick with Management Sciences for Health, which is a nonprofit health group active in a variety of developing countries. A question, I couldn't agree with you more about your observation about the Gates investment in creating new solutions, new technical solutions versus simply disseminating and delivering the existing solutions. And sort of following up a little bit on the previous discussion, what would your observations be on the balance between creating clever new solutions for poverty reduction versus disseminating good information, sort of how-to information on already proven solutions? Because I think there's a parallel between creating clever solutions versus disseminating them.
Yeah. I don't know if this answer will surprise you or not, but I would say that the key missing ingredient is not either good existing solutions or clever new solutions, but a process to get buy-in from all the different constituencies, including those affected by the problem related to poverty, so that they have the will and the commitment and the focus to work together on it. I don't think that solutions are missing. I think it is the willingness to work together to achieve those solutions.
Can I get a follow-up?
Well, since I'm on the MSH board, what can I say?
Well, the question is more how you get. If you say that there's already kind of an existing menu of solutions, and how do you get those out to the people who might benefit? Just a very specific example.
Yeah, give me an example.
4 days ago, I was in Afghanistan in the Panjshir Valley, and we were up there, and 80% of the Mujahideen are out of work, and it's starting to, basically a very strong culture, but without an economic base. They know nothing about, they've got streams up there, if they can catch a trout, they'll eat it, there's not so much trout left. They know nothing about trout farming. It turns out there's somebody who's there who's brought that idea in. Probably once it's demonstrated, because the folks there are clever industrials, they'll get it. But if somebody hadn't kind of come in with that idea, and so it's this whole idea of getting the idea, but also one level deeper. Once you got the idea, how do you access the sort of the how-to part of it?
And the how-to being, in this case, the technical assistance or the funding, or both?
Well, more the technical assistance. It actually doesn't take a lot to funding-wise.
So that sounds to me like why groups like yours exist, right?
Actually, we're not into fish. But it's just getting, for any community that's looking to develop economically, it's getting that kind of menu of options, you know?
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. There's the Kandori Trust, which is in Hong Kong, has for years been working in Nepal, basically building low-head hydro dams. Okay, that's very, very, very low-tech, very simple process. And with that dam, the economics of that village or region completely revolutionized because of the source of water. So I think, I'm not sure there's more of a violent agreement here in terms of what you're both saying, but there is this interesting tension between, especially for donors looking to do that nifty, exciting, cute new thing, as opposed to doing that thing which is there. But you seem to be implying, Peggy, consistently that philanthropy, as you see it from a working on issues like poverty globally, can be that glue, can be that knitting together. And yet, Paula Johnson earlier was telling me that there is a view that you've got the United Nations with these immense goals, and then you've got philanthropy over here, and there isn't a meshing. True, you think?
That there isn't a meshing? I think probably there isn't, because the lack of connection, which is, I think, what you're getting at, the lack of access, what I said back from when I was 17 and saw this in Brazil, the lack of access to information about these things. And then even if you have the information, how do you find out who to go to who could give you that connection? So the UN, actually, the United Nations Development Program, is beginning to think of itself as a facilitator of dialogue. That to me would be a very interesting role for the UN, because it does have offices in I don't know how many 190 or whatever countries, and it could actually be a center for dissemination of that kind of information if it saw its role as that. Rather than thinking that it had to do it all, it could help marshal people of goodwill and organizations that have the trout-producing skills that are needed for a situation in northern Afghanistan.
So if I'm sitting in Dayton, Ohio, as somebody who's participating is sitting, and I want to begin to think about doing something about this problem, where do I begin?
I guess when you say this problem, are you talking about poverty?
We're talking about
generally?
poverty.
So I guess I would begin in a couple of different ways. First of all, I would begin in my own community, finding out who else is interested and who's doing what, because it can be very isolating if you're the only person in your community and you don't even know where to begin, and you go somewhere to the web and you're trying to connect to the right organization. Whereas if there are people, and there are in most communities in the U.S. already doing things, to form a group at home is very empowering. Same philosophy I've just been expressing about everything else. And secondly, the web obviously has a lot of information about a lot of possible organizations. It would take a certain amount of research. I'm not saying there's one source. Maybe there is, but if there is, I don't know it, that one can go to and that will let a young person of, say, 23 who wants to volunteer know exactly what the best way to do that is. I don't know, is there somebody in the room who has a better idea?
How about Paula Johnson? Do you have a comment? You were trying to ask a question before I
think there are some other sources, but it's I think it's really lacking this year. There is no central place to go for information on global giving. And TPI could post some of the resources that are available, but there's not a centralized place. But I actually want to follow up, Peggy, on the comments that you were making on community participation in the development process, because I think it raises one of the great paradoxes and real challenges of international philanthropy. I think that if there's any agreement within the development field, it's that solutions to poverty and development need to be country-based and need to include community participation. At the same time, international philanthropy, I think, is often driven by donor priorities and interests. And in fact, the infrastructure that has grown up in the United States to support international philanthropy is primarily issue-based. So you can invest in women or in children or in the environment or in human rights. Synergos, I think, is one of the exceptions of a group that has addressed a whole kind of complex poverty community-based question. Now, I guess I'd just like to ask you to reflect more on how we might bring together the sectors of development and philanthropy more, because I think they are sectors that need to talk more with each other and learn from each other, and both have much to learn from the other. But they are not groups that often meet in any kind of context.
So let me try to pick that question apart in two ways. One is whether it's okay to focus on children or women or health or whatever, and the other is whether you include those who are affected by the problem in the solving. And I think that, for example, if you look at the Global Fund for Women or the Global Fund for Children, in my view, those are quite participatory organizations. So if someone says, I'm interested in women, and particularly women who've been abused in one way or another, you can be pretty sure that the people who are doing the funding have done the research into groups that genuinely try to empower women who've been in very difficult circumstances, and that your grant is probably going to go to that type of group. So in my view, that covers one piece of the issue, which is the inclusiveness of the approach. It does say women are our priority, and particularly abused women, and it doesn't look at health or economic development in particular. So that doesn't get to the second issue. I guess, in saying that I think there needs to be an inclusive and participatory approach, I'm not trying to deprive those who have some dollars they want to allocate, few or many, from making priority choices. I think it is legitimate to say, to me, the thing that most rends my heart is that there are children who haven't been vaccinated out there and they just don't have a chance at life. And I want to give my money to that. What I would hope is that in thinking which program that person decided to give its money to was one that took into consideration the importance of the community getting invested in the health of their own children and having a say in how that happened, together with the, quote, experts and outsiders. So I'm less disturbed. Partly, I just don't think it's practical to say everybody's got to give to these global general things. I think it's okay to choose a theme or an issue that really interests you. But what I would encourage people is to try to apply the dollars to that theme in a way in which it's not just going to be a top-down application, but we'll have a chance of engaging the communities that are going to benefit in designing their own solutions.
David Ford. Peggy, I had not heard the phrase before, or if I did, I don't remember it, of whole system partnerships. I really like it. I think it's got applicability for all sorts of situations, this country as well as abroad. So much has been learned in the 40 years you've been attending to these issues. I haven't been involved in international philanthropy for that long, for quite some years. How do you avoid getting depressed, though, by the fact that poverty has continued to increase in this country as well as abroad? We know so much more about how to do good things, whole system partnerships. I mean, that's wonderful, and it's a clear concept. And people have been doing. I mean, people were doing it before the phrase was invented, obviously, in some cases. But how can you keep your spirits up when, with all the good things that have been learned, the green revolution, the education that has taken place in all sorts of places around the world, the fact that vaccinations are indeed reaching more people, and poverty continues to increase?
Yeah, well, there are days.
You want to go on a 3-day retreat at your ranch in Montana and come back and
helps.
answer David Ford's question?
No, that helps. I guess what I would say, David, is first of all, in some countries, poverty is reducing. You can see changes in some countries.
Which? Couple of
China and India.
Yeah,
China and India.
yeah, for sure.
Good point.
And those are huge countries. You have the example of Costa Rica, which is investing a huge percentage of its budget in the education of its people and not in defense, and they're doing pretty well compared to certainly other Central American countries. So that helps to have.
Feeling better.
Yes.
It's easy.
That helps to have examples out there. Another issue that we haven't talked about is that the population is increasing. So in other countries, the number of people getting out of poverty is increasing, but the number of people is increasing. So it's not that nothing is being done or that none of these programs have had any effect, but you're just dealing with a larger and larger population of people, which is a sobering thought in itself because of the implications of how does one manage these increasing numbers. But I guess my real answer to that, David, and it's for a much longer discussion, but I'll just put it out there. I don't think that the whole system is going to shift until there is a transformation of the human heart, as Joseph Jaworski says. That means starting with ourselves and then working outward in mostly small increments. Mary Oliver, in one of her poems, talks about saving the one life you have to save, meaning your own. And she doesn't mean survival, she means self-transformation. So when I start to feel desperate about the entire world, I try to focus on whether it's possible for me to transform anything about myself and the way I relate to other people in such a way that might make it more likely that other people might work on their own transformation and the way they relate to other people. Because that's what it's going to take, really, to get to the bottom of this.
There's a wonderful a line from a man named Bill O'Brien, who was the CEO of Hanover Insurance Company, in which he says that the success of the intervention is directly dependent on the inner condition of the intervener. And I really think that's true. But I have another answer to David's question, and it does go to the issues of the numbing numbers and the overwhelming stasis that I think that we're really caught in. And for me, the way to get out of it is to do something very concrete, something very small. And one of the problems with our discussion is that we're really at 30,000 feet, and almost everything is not. And to build on Peggy's comment that not everybody will do or should do one thing, the truth is the vast majority of us, donors, NGOs, whatever, we get traction when we do something very concrete and specific. And in fact, in the TPI experience, the entire question of how to make a better world, how to make a world better, has been concrete. If we haven't been concrete, we haven't done it. There are some people, of whom my friend here is one, who really is able to think in ways that are this extraordinarily systemic ways. The vast majority of people do not think that way, and most of us need both.
David Squire. And
a little louder, David.
David Squire, and I, a long time ago, represented the United States on economic and social matters in the UN, and I'm on the board of TPI. I think we can all agree that collaboration, partnerships, the technical know-how is there, empowering people, participation, very important. But you've got a primary need of funding. And the U.S. is the primary possible funder, not just from the government, which is the second lowest of the 22 developed countries in terms of its aid, but both government and private philanthropy, what it needs in order to realize what it needs to do is to deal from a self-interest point of view. We all have the moral view, many of us have the moral view of the importance of it, but if you can put it into self-interest terms, it will be much more useful. We can't expect that from the government, at least these days, and I don't think ever. And nor is it necessarily the role of government to lobby or propagandize. But private foundations, private philanthropy, ought to make a special effort to educate the American public, both to push the government to give more, and it will at the same time, by educating people in terms of private philanthropy, do the same thing, of self-interest. And a good group of economists can do that, can figure out, we can actually statistically see where it's in my interest if we can export more to the developing world. And the way you can do that is if the level of poverty is less and the level of consumption is more. So that's a suggestion.
Yeah, for those of you interested in the role of philanthropy, not so much globally, but more domestically, from a public policy perspective, we can refer you to the WGBH web forum, which has the Tuesdays of TPI session that we did on that in, when did we do that? A year ago, I guess it was. But you're right, and you do bring up, though, David, the fact that most foundations, most donors are very cautious, very, very careful, and concerned about being advocates, and yet we see time and time again you can't do any of these things without being an advocate in the public policy arena.
Could I just give you one example of how it worked? In the 20th century, in my time at the UN, the Rockefeller Foundation did the most of anything in the world about population, and did it, not just gave money, but taught many people in the U.S. government at the time and other governments around the world of the value of educating people in terms of population and birth control, etc. And that had a tremendous impact. And that's the kind of thing that can be done by the private sector.
Leslie Pine from TPI. I just want to build on that comment and Peggy's thought about how people can really get connected, starting locally and then sort of branching out in the discussion earlier about how do we start to create a different sense of, you know, thinking about people in the United States, of thinking about the world more holistically. And there's a startup effort in this community in Boston that is not a foundation-driven effort, but it's an effort, it's called the Boston Network for International Development, and it's an effort to really get students involved in thinking about how they can get connected through internships, through jobs and career options after they get out of college or out of graduate school, and different resources to just help them feel that they have a way to get connected and to get plugged into different ways of following a path towards the kinds of things we've been talking about. And I just throw that out there as, I think a really interesting approach using technology, using the internet and helping people get connected in a local community, but as a way to think about the world. I'm curious whether you know of anything like that happening in other locations. And what I like about it is it's not just for donors, and everyone has something that they can give, whether it's time or intelligence or money or some combination of all of those things, as Peggy said earlier. Mm-hmm. So I'd just be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yes, I mean, just in New York, where Synergos is, I know of two, and I know of three of those kinds of networks. I don't know their web addresses, but I bet one would be able to get them. One is called IDN, the International Development Network, which is for young professionals that meet together but also have a web-based connection. Another is a group called Global Kids, which is largely high school level, that operates out of the New York City Public Schools. And a third is a new network called 2020, which is also for young professionals that I think is somehow linked with the Council on Foreign Relations. So those are just three for the same basic population, students and young professionals, to find a way to link up and be useful.
In the emerging science of open source philanthropy, Leslie's comment is a good one, because I think what is clearly happened in the true technology world, with the open space platforms that exist that connect in different ways, how those now play in to this universe of people who care about poverty, who care about things, has only just begun. And we know, because TPI has been part of the movement toward giving circles and organizations like SVP and others that are in fact gathering people around issues. We know that the gathering part works. And then how to use a technology like that tiny little camera that is sitting up there, it absolutely boggles my mind that somehow that's communicating out there to everyone. And I don't think we know how to use it. And there's another piece that to me is a big one. And I think we have to redo the way the supply side and the demand side meet. And I'm particularly struck. I'm on John O'Quick's Management Sciences for Health board, and I'm struck by the amount of incredible knowledge base within the 1,200 people who work for MSH in 19 countries around health issues, and how the donor from USAID operates. And it's exactly the way most foundations operate, where in essence it is the foundation which is the source of all higher knowledge. And the recipient community is the supplicant. It's a waste of talent. It's a waste of knowledge. We're not doing it right. So how to upstream that, to me, is part of this notion. We have a question from...
I'm Diane Hamish, and I'd like to make an observation from a donor's point of view. When one gives money to an organization for a specific purpose, we really should have accountability, a follow-up, because from our experience we found out that some of the monies we thought were going to a direct program weren't particularly focused on what our issue was. And so we sent personnel to examine it for us, found out that it was going into a lot of management, but not to the people intended for. The second part of that is that the particular program was, another program was orphans and vulnerable children. When our observers went to find out, they saw that the vulnerable children, orphaned by AIDS, were getting nutrition and going to school. But the households in which they were living, the rest of the household, the 10 other children, were not going to school and were not getting nutrition, nor was the grandparent, who the grandmother was providing all the care. So you have a responsibility as a donor to look beyond giving the money, if you're an organization or an individual.
Yeah, it's such a good point, and my guess is that not every donor is going to have or take the time to go do that, which then raises the question, okay, but what about those who get moved by an issue and want to write a check? How do they get that kind of accountability?
Hire a TPI.
Well, it's a serious issue, the whole question of accountability and how one does that, and it is especially, I mean, it's one of the big inhibitors to Americans giving abroad, because they realize how tough that is to do. But it's one of the, I mean, there is, I think, increasingly opportunities for anyone on this call or anyone in America to give globally in a way that they couldn't before.
I wanted to build on the discussion that started here.
And Tom
Hazlett. Yeah, I'm sorry. And that is that as you look backward over decades of philanthropy, and we look forward to decades of philanthropy in this new open space, does the industry have the capacity to transform itself? And where I'm going with this, echoing the question or the observation we just heard, is the role of fiduciary. And I'm imagining a time when an individual, Peter's reference to Dayton, Ohio, can access through the internet an AIDS orphanage in Calcutta and direct $10,000 of his or her wealth to Calcutta without the interference of the Ford Foundation, of the wise people who work in all these
at
different
TPI.
Perhaps. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts about that shift?
Well, it's interesting. When Alan Remmer, my colleague Alan Remmer, produced the What's a Donor to Do report 5-6 years ago, one of the which was a look at philanthropy, at the new philanthropy, what was happening. One of the recommendations was what would we call it? Knowledge management. And I remember very distinctly Steve Case at AOL, who they've been a TPI client for some time. I remember him saying so distinctly, we have that capacity. We know how to do that. That can be done. We can take those kinds of things out. So it's once again where technology isn't the issue. There's no question about that. But there's been very little investment by philanthropy, by foundations, in the infrastructure of this field in many, many ways.
Bob Holler, Melville Trust. In my experience, and that certainly reflects much of what you're saying, Peggy, there are a number of effective development agencies in the United States that look upon community development through the eyes of those who are the recipients and who work on the grassroots level. And I think from a donor point of view, it only makes sense to think about working with those agencies and organizations that already have that commitment, rather than trying to change organizations that operate out of air-conditioned offices in Nairobi. Rather, you want to be working with development people who understand the territory and are willing to work with the people in a particular village and understand that from their point of view, what it is they need the most is probably access to clean water, and how do we get that, and fund from that point of view, rather than the point of view of the assumption is that what people need are
Whatever.
full palette of vaccines, which they probably do need too, but without the clean water, there will never be adequate development in that community.
Can I comment on that?
Yes.
Because I don't want to be too extreme in going to that end of the spectrum. I think there's a lot of philanthropic work to be done at the policy level, at the convening level,
Absolutely.
so that the connections actually will be there all the way up and down the spectrum. So I wouldn't
Yeah.
advocate every single person giving to a specific village, because if we don't develop the policy environment and the structures that can make those connections, then
That's
they'll
why
still.
those international intermediaries are really crucial. It's choosing the right ones. And it's also, as you're suggesting, having an impact on policy, because governments really have control of a good deal more money than philanthropy does. And exercising the power and the impact of government policy can really create revolutionary change.
I want to go back to
You are, yes.
Charitable Bank of America. I want to go back to your comment about stakeholders in India, because I think it might be illustrative of some of the things that have been spoken about. But you were saying in that situation, you don't think it's a lack of resources or ability, and it is a question of the stakeholders. Can you talk about what you think would need to happen there to change it, so that you've got solutions, the resources, but more needs to happen?
Yeah. And this is, we're at very early stage understanding of the issues, so I'm probably, to someone who knows a lot about child malnutrition in India, I'm probably going to sound very ignorant and naive. So with that as a proviso, I'll now launch in shamelessly. So what I think is that, you have the government, various ministries, both at the national level and at the state level, some good, some bad, some corrupt, some committed, etc. But basically with a government policy to spend a lot of money on mothers' education and on getting micronutrients into the foods that families in different parts of the country eat. Basically a lot of the right stuff is already being said and even in some cases done, although probably a third to a half of the money is just disappearing from that. And then you have at the grassroots groups like Gram Vikas that I mentioned and various others that are so good. And they may be dealing with 5,000, 30,000, 100,000 people, which begins to sound very large, except when you're dealing with an overall population of 1.2 billion, it is another drop in the bucket. So there are kind of two simultaneous questions. One is, how do you get the various government agencies working together with these grassroots activists who are doing good things and connecting? How do you get the business smarts of the corporate world thinking about those systems issues and helping the systems to work better? How do you get the money that is available to actually get to where it's supposed to be going? And then the overall piece, which is how do you get both vertically and horizontally in the areas that you've targeted to work, because you can't choose all of India all at once, to come together to really see together the dimensions of the problem, see it in a different way by seeing it with each other and therefore through each other's eyes in the discussions that they have, so that what they'll come out of at the end of the time of joint investigation is common strategies, common solutions, and common commitment to work at the problem across all the barriers, whether vertical or horizontal or ideological. But if I didn't get to what you were asking, ask more.
Well, I think that's a great answer. And Peggy, before we're going to wrap up in the next 5 or 6 minutes, but come back to this intriguing business of the human heart. The human heart. And I too love that phrase from Joe Jaworski in the book Presence. But how does one do that? I mean, what have you learned in that exploration?
Well, I'm at the very beginning of this journey, but let me say it this way. There is our egos, which is the self that we present to the world. And then, and this is thinking, fairly abstractly, there is what I would call our souls. We're all born with an individual soul and with a purpose in life. But the circumstances of our lives tend to shape our egos according to those circumstances and not necessarily according to what our deeper purpose and the deeper meaning of our life is. And especially in this culture, we tend to do all the time. We don't just be. We don't reflect. We don't meditate. We don't even pray. And so the question is...
Some people do pray.
Some people do pray. Some people meditate. Some people reflect. Some people take time off. But the energy of this country is in doing, by and large. And without coming back to a deeper reflection, which I would connect, by the way, to being in nature, because I think the human species, especially the urban human species, has gotten too far away from where we came from. And there are ways, even in an urban park, of getting back into nature and listening to a bird. But going deeper within ourselves about what that ultimate purpose is, which can get us out of the momentary worries about what I was supposed to be doing that I forgot, or what I have to do next week, or the speech that I have to write for the week after, that gets us so anxious and so into a cycle of doing and worrying and fretting that we aren't our deepest purpose selves. So there are various courses of getting there. It's a long struggle for those of us who are into frenetic activity. But I actually don't see how we're going to get through this individually or more fundamentally together unless we start engaging in those practices.
That's beautiful. And when I think about philanthropy and its spectrum, I would put what you just said, that inner knowing, on one side. And then I'd put the heavy concentration on process on the other side. And TPI's been in the middle. TPI has been all about values and passions, which is closer, different words, but I think saying the same sort of kind of thing. And one of the, to me, if there is going to be an open source philanthropy, it very much means an opening of the individual as well, so that when you're in that room, you're not only in there as donor or NGO or whatever you are, you're really in there as you with your humanness. So I'm going to end our session. Before I do, though, I want to, with a poem. Before I do, end it, though. For those of you here, there are little surveys to fill out. All of you who have participated in this conference online, is that the correct phrase, Sandy? Online, will be getting a survey in the mail. In addition, those of you who would like to comment on the World We Want paper that went out to you and on the essay open source, we're interested in those comments because this is all evolving as we're doing. We'd love your emails to us here, or you can even go on the blog that our friend Phil Cubator has set up, www.theworldwewant.org. We have our own URL. And here's a poem I'm going to end with that I think has relevance to many of these themes. It's called Admonition. Tell me stories of kinship, of tropes of caritas, effortless across a world stage. Tell me what you want to hear. In the face of fury, moderation is a great fiction, a rhetorical stance subject to guile. Too much is at stake. What good are voices of goodwill? Sleepwalkers haunt my dreams. The cascade of moments has begun. This macrocosm, this heart will break. Sometimes you are the only actor. alone in the audience of your soul, or your God if you admit to one, you cannot, you dare not, abdicate. Thank you all very much for being with us.